Imagine waking up on an ordinary Monday in Detroit. You drive past the GM plant, see workers arriving, horns blaring, cars roaring. Everything is normal, but 2 days later, silent. No delivery trucks, no spare parts in stock. The steel is simply gone. Here are the effects of a single decision. An executive order signed by Donald Trump in June 2025 that doubles tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports to 50%. And it wasn't directed against China, nor against Russia. It was directed against Canada, America's largest trading partner, their closest ally, their most reliable neighbor. The decision had the effect of a bomb on Wall Street, in the corridors of Washington, and, above all, on the production lines of the American industrial belt. Trump pulled the trigger and expected the world to collapse. Instead, he witnessed the collapse of Detroit and the rebirth of Hamilton, Canada. Behind the scenes, the measure was considered catastrophic, even before its official announcement. Economists sounded the alarm. It's not just a centimeter, it's an earthquake. Governors in states that rely on the auto industry, such as Michigan and Ohio, received no warning. The entire industry was surprised. And in a trade war, surprise is the first step toward victory. In less than a week, the effects were already visible. Customs data revealed something worrying. Canadian steel exports to the United States have fallen by nearly 100%. It was neither a gradual reduction nor a logistical delay. A shutdown occurred, as if someone had pulled the emergency brake on the economy. Detroit felt it on its skin. Factories closed, shifts were canceled, inventories were depleted, prices tripled overnight. Ford and GM, once seemingly indestructible giants, have entered into a fierce competition to attract suppliers in the international market. Each ton of alternative fuel cost up to 3 times more compared to what came from Canada in the past, and of inferior quality. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, in Hamilton, Windsor and Sault Ste. Marie, a silent miracle occurred. Steel mills returned to full capacity. Night shifts resumed. Previously empty parking lots filled up again. Hot steel, smoke in the sky, smiles on faces. How could such a sharp drop in exports have gone unnoticed? How could Canada freeze the continent's largest industrial nation without any explanation? The truth is, none of this was spontaneous. It wasn't a misstep, it was a strategy, a cold and calculated approach, and, perhaps more frightening for Americans, completely legal. Detroit panicked. But Ottawa remained silent. No press conference, no retaliatory decree, no inflammatory tweet. Canada reacted differently than Trump expected. He didn't fight. He just turned away. And this, more than any embargo or threat, struck at the heart of American industry. Because what was lost wasn't just steel. It was trust. It was predictability. It was strategic security. In the United States, the consequences began to multiply at a frantic pace. Ford announced in its second quarter report an increased production costs of $2.5 billion only during the first 6 months of the year. 2 commas, 9 zeros, a single customs decision costs billions, and we haven't even talked about layoffs yet. In practice, this increase hits where it hurts most. Trucks, SUVs, best-selling cars, products whose profit margins had previously been acceptable were now reaching their limits. Some assembly lines were slower, others simply turned off. In Michigan, the effects were felt immediately. The state, which had kept its economy afloat, saw its unemployment rate rise from 4% to 5%. 4% in just 12 months, the country's biggest annual leap. And economists are sounding the alarm. If things continue as they are, the American Midwest could sink into an isolated recession. But the silence coming from the North was even more disturbing. Why didn't Canada respond with tariff? Why didn't it raise the issue in the media? Why didn't it accuse Trump of trade aggression? Because they didn't need to. Canada was not at war. It was rebuilding. And this reconstruction had not begun in June, but years earlier, as part of an industrial policy that was now revealing its true face. Trump expected a confrontation. Canada opted for a far more deadly solution: distancing. And as any good strategist knows, if your enemy is about to stumble, don't push him. Just make room for him. But was this separation just an impulsive reaction? Or had Canada been preparing for this change for much longer than anyone thought? This answer could completely change our vision of the future. As supplies dwindled in Detroit and the entire world watched the American industrial chaos, on the Canadian side of the border, a very different reality was unfolding. In Hamilton, the chimneys were smoking again. In Windsor, the sirens were wailing again. And in Sault Ste. Marie, for the first time in years, the roar of blast furnaces replaced the silence of idled factories. Canada didn't react with retaliation. It conditioner. Imagine a worker like Jacob, 49, a fourth-generation steelworker and father of 3. Over the past 5 years, he's seen his hours cut, then his pay cut, and finally his layoff. In January 2025, he was delivering pizzas to make ends meet. In July, he was called back to the steel mill, full pay, night shift, and a parking lot full of former colleagues he hadn't seen since the pandemic began. What changed? The decision to stop exports. But this was an unofficial event. The Canadian government neither issued a national statement nor publicly announced its decision in Parliament. I just rewrote the background story. He changed public procurement guidelines. He required stricter environmental standards for energy infrastructure. In doing so, he authorized the importation of all domestic steel into the country without changing a single tariff, without breaking a single rule. Detroit was not attacked, it was abandoned. And for companies like Ford and GM, it was even worse. In war, at least, you know who you're fighting, but when the tracks don't lead to the goal, the cars are empty, and the orders dry up. All that remain is the rearview mirror and unanswered questions. In the industrial areas of downtown Detroit, where auto body shops and parts manufacturers line every corner, signs of collapse quickly appeared. Fewer deliveries, more layoffs, quieter streets, customers saying, "Let's take a break." Bit by bit, the pillars of the supply chain crumbled, and with them, the small businesses that support thousands of families every day. You can even smell it in the supermarket. Used car prices skyrocketed. Replacement parts took weeks to arrive. Car insurance premiums soared. Even the renovation of your city's flyover may have been delayed because the contractor didn't deliver the steel beams on time. It all started with a presidential executive order in Washington and strategic silence from Ottawa. It should be noted that Canada has not imposed an embargo. There is no document prohibiting exports. It's the logic that has changed. Suddenly, companies that previously relied on American production were incentivized to turn to the domestic market. The government told them, "You want to sell steel? Prove it's clean, and ideally, use it here." This means that Canada rebuilt its domestic market simply by realigning its interests. It was not about protection, but about reinvention. Meanwhile, the United States remained in the dark. Literally, some industrial parks began dimming their lights to cut costs. Entire industrial centers had to abandon half of their warehouses, and state governors, even Republican ones, began to pressure the White House. We've gone too far. Analysts at Auto Forecast Solutions have released an alarming report. Raw material costs increased by 6 to 9% in the second quarter alone. This had a direct impact on models like the Ford F-150, Chevrolet Silverado, and Ram 1500, cars that move America. With every week of delay, millions in profits were lost. And then comes the hardest blow: oil. For years, the Canadian energy sector purchased specialized steel pipe from the United States. This was high-pressure pipe for interprovincial gas pipelines crossing extreme climates, mountains, and rivers. These contracts were solid, predictable, and profitable, and they disappeared. Alberta, Canada's energy capital, tacitly changed its policy. Starting in 2025, all infrastructure projects will be required to use exclusively domestic steel, preferably with low environmental impact. The government has dubbed this strategy a green strategy. For American industry, however, it was a restrictive measure, market fraud disguised as sustainability. Companies in Ohio and Pennsylvania that relied on these contracts saw their orders immediately canceled. Their employees were laid off. Their factories operated at only 30% capacity. However, when they protested in international courts, they violated Canadian law because everything happened according to the rule. And this is where Americans' frustration turns to despair. Trump expected a tariff war, but Canada offered a masterful example of geo-economic planning. Instead of reacting, he changed the motive. Instead of taking revenge, production is redistributed. Instead of insulting, rebuilt. In doing so, he quietly destroyed one of the most powerful trade routes in North America, and the Americans could do nothing. Complaints mounted during congressional hearing. Rust Belt lawmakers demanded action. Canada is sabotaging us, they declared. But when lawyers dug into the details, they found themselves facing a legal nightmare. There was no violation. No clause was violated. No article was violated. Canada, he played with the manual in hand and still won. Meanwhile, Jacob, the factory worker from Hamilton, didn't care about American stocks. He bought a used car. He paid his daughter's college tuition, and he planned a vacation for the first time in 10 years. He didn't care that Detroit was bleeding to death. I could finally breathe. And this is the most unpleasant part. Perhaps Canada didn't do this against the United States. It simply did it, without them. By rebuilding its steel mill, Ottawa has not simply opened a new chapter. It became a whole chapter, and what seemed like a simple tariff dispute turned into a symptom of something much deeper, an economic, strategic, and political separation, a silent divorce. If you've read this far, you probably feel there's something to this story the media isn't telling you. And you're right. So enjoy this moment, because we are going to discover it together. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel. It costs nothing, but this really helps us continue to produce independent and critical content that goes beyond the headline. Because if this story teaches us one thing, it is that what seems like silence is sometimes just the sound of the next impending revolution. And in the third part, we will see what was really behind the Canadian reaction, or rather, of the plan that was already in place before Trump's action. Ready to see the full map? When the tariff storm erupted in 2025, the world expected a classic trade war. Trump was playing hardball. Canada would respond in kind, right? Tariffs against tariffs, an escalation, a standoff. But this never happened. No protests at international conferences, no harsh reprisals, no inflammatory speeches in Parliament. What happened quiet, planned, surgical, and absolutely devastating. This is the part of the story that almost no one tells. Canada did not resist, but simply changed its position. And he did it while playing with the international manual in his hands. How can you fight something that seems cool? The answer lies in the details. Ottawa didn't create tariff barriers. It created environmental incentives. It introduced traceability rules. It imposed sustainability standards for public construction projects. It mandated emissions tests. And with that, it has become economically unprofitable to import steel from the United States without having to ban anything. Sounds technical? Because it was. And that's exactly why should not be fought at the diplomatic level. At each hearing in the U.S. Congress, the protests intensified. "They're blocking our steel," the senators shouted. But when the lawyers analyzed the contracts, they realized the impasse. Canada has not broken any rule. Nobody. Zero. Does this seem fair to you? Instead of directly confronting each other, he used an invisible weapon, time. While the United States was fighting in Washington, Canada was strengthening its industrial system. But did this strategy come out of nowhere? Or has it been in the making for much longer? What if all this has already started, even before the customs tariff existed? Yes, it has started. Because in January 2025, a few months before Trump signed the agreement, Ottawa discreetly launched the Steel Modernization Fund, a multi-billion-dollar Canadian fund to transform the sector. But it wasn't a bailout. It was a national engineering project. The fund is based on 3 pillars: carbon reduction, strategic security, and industrial resilience. In other words, while Trump viewed tariffs as a political grenade, he had planned to rebuild the battlefield. What other G7 country do you know that predicts a crisis before it happens and creates a protective shield without firing a single shot? At the same time, the Canadian government's strict import quotas for countries outside the United States, only 50% of the previous year's amount would be allowed. and a 50% tax would be applied to this amount. Does that ring a bell? It's no coincidence. It was a subtle message. We can play this game too, but in our own way. See, the question is, why didn't the United States notice? Perhaps locked in its own echo chamber, the United States believed Canada would never dare leave. Who would give up the world's largest consumer market? But what happens when you're tired of depending on an unpredictable partner? This is when the most surprising twist occurs. Canada no longer wanted to be the obedient supplier of the United States. It wanted to be the leader of the future. And to achieve this, he even redesigned the foundations of his public projects. Bridges, subways, ships, schools, all with a new rule. The steel had to be clean, local, or recycled. If there was no carbon traceability, it wasn't even included in the notification. This was a radical turning point because it was not just an environmental project. It was an economic shield. Industrial restructuring disguised as climate responsibility. Can you imagine this model being adopted in the United States without causing hysteria in Congress? Perhaps this is why Ottawa did not expect to be recognized. They expected turbulence and resisted. The result? Clean steel producers now dominate the domestic market. Investments in sustainable technologies have increased rapidly. Innovations once considered experimental have become the norm. In doing so, Canada did something the United States had not even considered. It has created a closed, competitive, and clean market, ready to export its credibility. But what does this mean in concrete terms? This led European companies to begin preferring Canadian steel for one simple reason. It directly bypassed the European Union's climate barrier. While U.S. contracts were blocked due to emission, Canada was faced with the situation with a green seal. This advantage has a name: CO2 Pass. A climate certificate that confirms the origin and production process of the steel and which, in practice, opens the doors to international trade like a diplomatic passport. Steel is no longer just metal. It has become an instrument of foreign policy. And in this new chess game, Canada wasn't just exporting products. It was exporting its identity, its reputation, and its visions for the future. The United States still has brute force. But what about its legitimacy? What about its alignment with the markets that will dictate the rules of the future? For every ton of clean steel that crosses the Atlantic, an uncomfortable question resonates in Washington. If the world demands zero carbon emission, what exactly does the United States have to offer? While the House of Representatives debated the culprits and the Senate filed charges against the fans, Canada pursued a sober, silent, but extremely effective strategy. And here's the most awkward question of all. What if there are no more problems? What if the United States is already losing without even realizing it? Because one thing is clear, Canada no longer wants to win the old way. He doesn't want to be part of the game like before. He wants to change the rules of the game, and he succeeds. And the most painful thing? The Americans have no answer. Factories are closing, prices are rising, contracts are collapsing. All that remains is a sense of loss of control, not because of an attack, but because of an absence, a strategic absence. While the United States waited for the attack, Canada held back, and the land just disappeared. For decades, Canada was seen as North America's quiet brother, collaborative, predictable, friendly, a reliable partner in every treaty, war, or crisis. But in 2025, things began to change, and it didn't happen through wars of words or confrontation. It happened through projects. At first glance, it might seem like Canada was simply reacting to Trump's tariffs. But upon closer inspection, the truth becomes clear. Nothing was improvised. Export restrictions, the reorganization of the domestic market, new production criteria, all of this was already in place long before the fuse was lit. Let's stop for a moment, breathe, because what you're going to see now, this is not a series of events. It is a project, a national plan. In early 2025, a few months before the American decree, the Canadian government launched a package of measures that seemed bureaucratic and even too discreet by international standards. But this package of measures was in reality a manifesto of rupture. The heart of this change was the climate mandate for the steel industry. By 2035, all Canadian steel mills are required to use electric arc furnaces, EAF, no coal, no coke, no environmentally harmful explosion, clean steel, electric steel, steel of the future. But what if you don't understand what that means? Imagine, in the United States, producing 1 ton of conventional steel burns coal, releasing nearly 2 tons of CO2. In Canada, electric arc furnaces, EAFs, can produce the same ton with 90% fewer emissions. Now let's add something that only a few countries have, an almost entirely clean energy matrix. Hydroelectric power plants in Quebec, nuclear power in Ontario, wind farms in the Atlantic. Result? Canada is not only capable of producing clean steel, but it can demonstrate it with every contract. While the United States is still debating whether to preserve coal-fired power plants, Canada is already restructuring its production with green energy and verifiable data. And that changes everything. Unexpectedly, in July 2025, the European Union announced that imports of high-carbon steel would be profitable from 2026. Environmental tariffs up to 25% below the CBAM, CO2 ceiling adjustment mechanism. Canadian companies? They ignored us. American companies are lining up to pay. But it's not just about Europe. It's about the very concept of industrial leadership. And there appears a strange name, CO2 Pass. This passport is a certification that attests that the steel was produced using low-carbon methods, clean sources, and traceable processes. Canadian companies can sell in any country that requires ESG, environmental, social, and governance commitments. And that's not the future. And now, in August 2025 alone, more than 17 German, French, and Japanese companies signed exclusive supply contracts with steel mills in Ontario and Quebec. The focus was not on price, but on environmental credibility. Now think about the implications. If you were a European car manufacturer and wanted to sell cars certified as green, would you buy steel from the United States, made from coal, or from Canada, made from clean energy? And here's a story that sums it all up. In rural Ontario, a plant called ArcelorMittal Dofasco has become the symbol of a new era. The previous power plant was a traditional coal-fired plant, but today it is fueled by electric arc furnaces, has invested more than $8 billion in modernization, and has eliminated more than 80% of its emissions. The result? The company began selling its products on 3 continents, while its American competitors lost tenders. How did this happen? Why Canada made a decision the United States had avoided for decades. Link your industrial policy to climate policy, and that's when the story takes a turn. Steel is no longer just a raw material. It has become a diplomatic tool, a strategic currency, a story of sovereignty. But there is more. Another invisible pillar of this transformation was their cycled steel. Instead of rebuilding from scratch, Canada decided to change the rules of the game with what already existed. A 35% tax reduction has been approved for any steel mill that uses scrap metal as its main raw material. Soon, companies began converting their production lines to accept and melt scrap metal, old cars, bridge structures, construction debris. Is it simply about environmental protection? No. It's a question of strategy. Reusing is cheaper, cleaner, faster, and with electric ovens, the reuse cycle can be almost infinite. The city of Toronto, for example, has implemented a separate collection system for industrial waste. What was once considered waste is now sent to local factories. In Montreal, even agricultural machinery parts dating from the last century are delivered to sorting centers. And what was once scrap metal has turned into gold. Meanwhile, in the United States, rising production costs continue to be a subject of public debate. What's the problem? The solution was already there, on the other side of the border. Breath, shine, and think. If a country can reduce its costs, lower its emissions, and secure its supplies by using only what it already has, why do others insist on importing everything? The answer may not be economic, but ideological. As the United States discusses a traditional industrial renaissance, Canada builds a 21st century industry based on data, efficiency, and long-term intelligence. That's innovation. That's sovereignty. And this, above all, it's a vision. And it's not just for home consumption. It's now up to Canada to decide who to sell its products to. Companies without concrete climate commitments are being left behind. Projects involving coal, oil, or overexploitation are being cancelled. Anyone who wants to buy must demonstrate that they are on the same path. And this path has become Canada's hallmark, a silent diplomacy made of steel, not word. But what about the United States? They keep knocking on the door. They're trying to renegotiate the agreement. They're trying to stop the production losses. The problem, however, is not that Canada has abandoned the association. The problem is that it has changed direction. And if the world follows the same path, as Europe, Japan, and South Korea have already done, to whom will the United States export? This is the turning point. The separation, which began as a horror, turns into an abyss. And as you'll see in Part 5, the most disturbing thing may not be what Canada did, but he didn't succeed. Because sometimes the greatest power isn't in shouting, but turn around and continue. Ultimately, it wasn't a war. There were no tanks. There was no blockade. No treaties were broken. There were no fiery speeches at the United Nations. What happened between the United States and Canada in 2025 had far more far-reaching consequences. It was a silent realignment, a strategic distancing, a planned rupture between two countries once inextricably linked. For decades, the United States took it for granted that North America was its backyard, that its closest allies would never choose a different path, that every crisis could be resolved with a phone call, a promise, or a condition. But while Trump signed a tariff order to demonstrate his strength, Canada had already planned for its future. This was not an attack, but we must not depend on this, and it was perhaps the most effective measure of all. What seemed like a retaliatory measure against American protectionism was not. It was a liberation. Canada is not at war. It is in transition, and this transition changes everything. Steel was just the beginning, the symbol, the lever, but behind it all lies something larger. A complete restructuring of the meaning of production, trade, and cooperation. A doctrine of industrial independence, a carefully considered response to the chaos of world trade. While the United States viewed tariffs as a deterrent, Canada increasingly viewed trade as a means of exerting pressure, instrument of national identity. Look carefully. At no point did Ottawa say anything like, "We are abandoning the United States," and it didn't need to. The change happened by inertia, by free will, because nothing else could be expected from the other side. And this is perhaps the most disturbing element of this whole story. Because when someone ignores you, you react. But when someone stops relying only on yourself, if he takes you off the plan, there is nothing to answer. Trump built a tariff wall. Canada built a bridge to Europe. One isolated himself, the other repositioned himself. One relies on force, the other on technology. And now the paths on the geopolitical map of the 21st century are becoming increasingly clear. Who remains anchored in the past and who has already entered the future? At the heart of this change is the concept of priority. While the United States tries to keep the wheels turning with the same formulas, Canada focuses on supply chain control, environmental traceability, clean energy capacity, and diplomatic access. Steel has ceased to be steel. It has become a passport. It has become a story. It has become a burden. The question that remains is no longer, why did Canada do this? The question now is, why did it take so long? Seen from the right angle, it was all there. Green investments, industrial modernization, coordination between the provinces and the federal government, creation of a single market with clear, sustainable, and effective regulation. It was not a counterattack. It was an escape plan. And by the time the United States realized this, Canada was already gone. Today, Canadian steel mills sell their products to Japan, Germany, and South Korea. And they do so with a difference that no American steel mill can guarantee without falling into hypocrisy. Clean, testable, premium quality steel. As the U.S. Congress holds hearings to determine where we went wrong, the world is making deals with those who have already overcome the problem. What remains for the United States is not just a loss of supply, but also a loss of influence, importance, and centrality, because the center of the game has shifted, and those who don't move disappear. Do you realize what this means? The undeclared war between the United States and Canada is perhaps the clearest sign that the next conflicts will not be about territory or ideology, but about who controls the next generation of raw materials and how. Steel, copper, lithium, graphite, clean energy, data. And it's not enough to have them. We must know how to shape them according to new rules that go far beyond the market. They influence climate, ethics, sovereignty, and diplomacy. And anyone who doesn't understand this is excluded, not as a punishment, but because it doesn't matter. Canada has understood this. What will happen to the United States? If you've made it this far, it's because you know it's bigger than it seems, because you understand that we're dealing with something profound, invisible, and transformative. We have the feeling that there's much more to current events than meets the eye, that everything is happening in silence. And if we don't analyze it carefully, we'll get the impression that nothing happened. But it happened, and it still does today. Therefore, I would like to warmly invite you to participate in this ongoing research. Subscribe to the channel, like it. Tell us what you think of this subtle change. Because yes, your click is useful. It allows more people to discover this content. It shows the algorithm what it's about. Imported, and that's really important. Thanks for watching until the end. In the next study, we will go down another step to this global scale. There's still a lot to discover, and the next episode could change your worldview even more. See you there. And until then, remember, the greatest shocks of the 21st century will not come in the form of explosion, but of silent decision that will silently change everything.